Be getting started in just a few minutes. Before we do get into the formal part of the program, I just wanted to remind everyone of a couple of housekeeping things that we'd like for you to do. If you happen to not be muted through our software, if you would make sure that you're muted on your phone or however you're listening, we would appreciate that. And we'll have presenters give our presentations, and then at the end we'll have some time for Q&A. But if you do have questions during the presentation, just go ahead and type them into the chat box so that we can all see them. The chat box actually goes to everyone who's attending. The Q&A box is hidden and it sometimes doesn't get everywhere it's supposed to go. So if you would send your questions in chat, we would appreciate it so everyone can see it. If you have some other issue and you want to send something separately to one of the presenters, you can do that as well. And with that housekeeping taken care of, I'll just want to introduce Meg Phillips from the National Archives, who is here with us today. Meg is the NARA's External Affairs Liaison, and it's one of her duties to reach out to other groups. And we find that CoSA and the National Archives have so many things that we work together on, and CoSA's members and NARA's mission have so much in common that we're happy to have started this webinar program together. So Meg, did you want to say a couple of words to welcome our participants here today?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, it is a duty. It's one of my very favorite duties. It's the most fun thing I do, is reaching out to the state archives. So this webinar is the second in a planned ongoing series of quarterly webinars between the National Archives and CoSA members. And this one was inspired by our Great Ideas Exchange Day at the SAA-CoSA-NARA annual meeting. And it occurred to us that our audience for this discussion at that in-person meeting was mainly state archivists rather than the staff within the state archives who might be most interested in the details of how appraisal is done. So we figured it was worth following up and trying to reach out to the entire staffs of state archives so we can have more of an exchange and more of a discussion about some of the ways that states and the National Archives are approaching appraisal. So welcome. We're eager to learn more about what's going on in North Carolina, and I'm very happy that we're collaborating in this way. Thanks, Barbara.
And thank you very much, Megan. We're very happy to have all of our presenters here today. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Jamie Awalt from the Tennessee State Library and Archives. She is our moderator for today. Jamie?
Two from the National Archives, Margaret, Maggie Hawkins, who's the Director of Records Management and Operations, and Lloyd Beers, the Appraisal Archivist. Then we'll hear from State Archives of North Carolina, Sarah Koonts, who's the State Archivist, and Becky McGee-Lankford, who's the Government Records Section Manager and Assistant State Records Administrator. And of course, I'm Jamie Awalt, your moderator. So a little bit about how we'll go over the course of the next 55 minutes or so. I want to thank you again for joining us. As I said, we're going to begin with a presentation from Ms. Hawkins and Mr. Beers from NARA. They're going to present the Federal Case Study GSA Records Schedule Project. After their presentation, Sarah Koonts and Becky McGee-Lankford from the State Archives of North Carolina will present North Carolina Records Management, a Functional Schedule. We're then going to open it up for questions at the end of the second presentation. As Barbara said, you can submit your questions through the chat throughout the course of the program, and we'll monitor those and try to address all of them at the end. You can also wait until the end and submit your questions. We'll have about 10 minutes, I think, for questions and answers. Finally, Meg and Barbara are going to return back and make some announcements about upcoming programs and other things. So without further ado, Maggie and Lloyd, I'm going to pass it on to you. Well, you didn't, Barbara, can you pass it on to them? I'm not seeing if they're able to do that.
I'm looking. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Do you know how to make them a presenter, Mary Margaret? I think we have to do Lloyd. I don't see Maggie.
I am presently looking. Hang on a second.
I apologize while we're trying to work with our new software. We're very sorry, but we'll get Maggie and Lloyd on here very soon to talk about their record scheduling project with the General Services Administration. And I don't know, I think Meg had mentioned that several of us who were at the joint annual meeting and some of the state archivists who were there were able to hear these presentations, and we wanted to bring that to everyone who's here today.
I know Lloyd is registered as a panelist. I am not seeing Maggie in either the attendees or the panelist listing. If she wants to try to register as an attendee, we can make her a panelist. She could make the remarks, and we can move the slides forward as another option.
Do you want to turn it over to Lloyd?
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you're unmuted.
Oh, beautiful.
Okay,
okay, that's what I was waiting for. So,
right.
Hi, how you doing? And I was, flipping the slides back and forth, trying to get someone's attention there, so it's great. Hi, I'm Lloyd Beers, and I am here, and Maggie Hawkins will be in the room with me shortly. She's not going to be signing on separately. She is in a meeting right now, but she'll be joining us. So I just wanted to say, on behalf of Maggie and myself, thank you for asking us to present today, and also thank those of you who have joined the webinar for your interest in the presentation and for joining us today. So I wanted to talk about an interesting project that I've been involved in over the course of the last 5 years. Now, I kind of find that hard to believe and maybe even a little bit difficult to say, but because of the extent of this project, it has taken basically better than 5 years for us to do what would be called big bucket scheduling for the General Services Administration. So what we had to do is, first of all, we were approached by the agency, and we were asked if we could assist them in doing this because they had 140 record schedules, and because of the way that the GSA was organized, they had 5 different NARA record groups. Now, why that was true was because the GSA had several distinct lines of business that over the course of time had basically evolved into their own, records producing entities, that it was just easier for them and for NARA to recognize these lines of business sort of as distinct records groupings. So they had a record group for the General Services Administration as the main agency, and then they had a record group specific to the Public Building Service, which was nationwide across 10 or 12 regions across the country, specific to buildings. And then they had the Federal Acquisition Service, which was dealing primarily with property maintenance and disposal and surplus property. And, Federal Acquisition Service, which was for more of the supply aspects of the government. And then the Federal Property Resources Service, which was dealing with properties and surplus properties. And then finally, the Information Resource Management Services, which was the, communications for the federal government. So when they approached us, they wanted to bring all of their schedules up to date, and they wanted to make sure that, that they could streamline their records management and just make it more manageable. And one of their problems is that they had schedules that went back to as far back as 1976. And the reason for that was because there was a time, which we no longer do now, but there was a time where NARA would keep an existing authority in place as long as the disposition for that item didn't change. So the GSA had a very lovely filing manual of 50 or so chapters, and periodically they would submit a chapter to NARA for approval as a complete record schedule. And if only say 80% of the items, or if only 20% of the items in the schedule actually had some change to them, those would be the only items that would be recognized and brought forward as new authorities. The others would basically be crossed out and considered to be previously scheduled under the old schedule. So as a result of that, even today, there were still items that were covered under these original schedules where they were originally scheduled in the 70s, but at the same time, the agency was using a filing manual that chapters of which might have been submitted with a schedule. So internally, they were thinking that, well, we're going to use this authority, which was correct in of itself because the chapter was an approved chapter, but they were using what turned out to be an inaccurate authority because the original authority that it was submitted under was crossed out in favor of an already existing authority because the item didn't change. So that was very challenging for everyone in terms of actually being able to go back and supersede existing items and make sure that we were creating a new schedule with nothing left over. And then on top of that, in the course of doing this project, our general record schedule team was feverishly working on updating all of NARA's general record schedules. So as we were doing that, new general record schedules were being brought online, and also they were being updated and modernized for the 21st century. So we could then go through some of these old schedule items that needed to be previously scheduled, and now they could be incorporated into the GRS, and they wouldn't need to schedule them individually. They could use the general record schedule. And then finally, we wanted to the agency wanted to allow the flexibility that big bucket scheduling allowed in being able to add or subtract items from a bucket to be able to work with their evolving lines of business, because it seems that all the time GSA was being involved in some new level of or at least from the government standpoint, new level of technology that they wanted to play a role in. So one of the challenges, the first challenge, was that we had to get over the initial start of the project, which actually took place before I came to Appraisal and took over the project. The original shape of this project had to be abandoned because it really was not well thought out or conceived, and it turned out that what the agency wanted to do was not going to conform with what actually a big bucket schedule would look like. And it also didn't work from the standpoint of they were trying to place more emphasis on buckets based on retention rather than the types of records. So we kind of had to go back to the drawing board and take a look at how we were going to do this and what structure we were going to give to the schedule. So the first thing we had to do is look in particular at the lines of business and see exactly what the best way was to frame the schedule. And we decided in looking at this that there were, because before they had used, they had 5 different record groups and treated all these lines of business as sort of separate entities, that a lot of their offices and organizations had very similar types of records that might have been scheduled across 5 different record groups in different chapters of their manual because they wanted to keep everything segregated. So the first thing that we had to do, once we established some sort of a rough structure on how we wanted to organize the schedules going forward, was what I like to refer to as wrangling all of the legacy authorities, which is what the agency had to do in terms of taking, and at this point they did not have any sort of consolidated means of looking at all of their authorities to say, okay, this is every record schedule authority that we have, and these are the records that go with them. So that's why that was the real impetus behind this project. So the first thing we had to do was to wrangle all of the legacy authorities, which also you have to remember during the 70s and the 80s, microfilming was a popular alternative to capturing larger bodies of records. So certain schedules existed with the idea that you were going to microfilm things and then in turn dispose of the paper copies and so forth. So we had to take a hard look at all of the items and the media and medium that they were related to, and then get a listing of all of the authorities and what records they covered, and then reconcile those across the 5 record groups so that we could say, okay, if we had this type of record, it would only need to be scheduled once, and we were going to put all of these types of records under the main GSA record group and try to reduce the number of records in all of the other record groups related to the lines of business, and therefore just have basically specific program records under these other record groups, and hopefully be able, and we were able to eliminate one record group altogether because it turned out to be unnecessary. So with all of this, you have to have the key item here is being able to have the program office cooperation, because this requires inventorying to identify what records are currently being made, what are no longer being made, and what records were currently scheduled and what records needed to be scheduled that weren't scheduled. So this was a huge challenge, step by step, to be able to get the program offices to work in conjunction with this project so that we could wind up with only authorities for records that were currently being produced and those legacy authorities that we needed for things that might have been in long-term storage for eventual disposal. Now, permanent records were already more or less taking care of themselves because there was not a lot of change in terms of what was already being considered permanent and what went on to become permanent once again. There were a few things, obviously, that were being captured as new records that would be permanent, or perhaps the description would change. But by and large, a lot of this had to do with organizing all of the temporary authorities. So, again, we had to definitively identify what would now be identified as GRS items versus program records. And this is a little bit tricky with the General Services Administration, because a lot of the work that the General Services Administration does, those types of records might be considered GRS records for an agency that was doing that as, say, financial records or those sorts of things, whereas these would be actually program records and policy records for the GRS. So there was a little trouble sometimes with the program offices getting them to see that perhaps their records that they were producing were not GRS items, but they were actually program records that had to be considered differently. And then along with that, we had to deal with issues of perceived retention, I like to call it, and that is that the program offices had their own notions about how long they wanted to keep their records, especially, of course, the temporary records, and that was not always consistent with the banding that we were trying to do in terms of the actual retention. So what we were trying to do was have more or less a standard 3-year retention for certain levels of routine records, a 7-year retention for those that might have some, legal implications, and then, of course, the permanent records were retained for a minimum of 15 years prior to transfer to the National Archives. Now, of course, we could be flexible with specific offices like the Office of Inspector General or the General Counsel Office or different ones that definitely did have specific needs. But for the most part, we were trying to limit or to standardize those retentions, which was something that was a little difficult to understand for people who always want to have the records at their fingertips. And then the same was true with trying to get cutoff and disposition instructions, especially for things that you might want to cut off and retain for a certain number of years, but not necessarily keep them in the program office. So by and large, we had pretty good luck with the program offices and finally getting them around to, agreeing to the sorts of disposition that we were looking to standardize. And then, of course, just in general, we had to mediate stakeholder concerns and adjudicate those concerns because in a lot, again, it usually had to deal with retention, but everyone has their own sort of personal feelings about how important their records are and what their business needs are, and we had a lot of trouble with sort of open-ended dispositions where they would like to, have it so that they could keep it as long as business needs dictated, which basically allowed them to keep it for forever. So what we tried to do there was to say, for example, no less than 3 years, no sooner than 3 years, but no longer than 7 or no longer than 10, just to give them a sort of a drop-dead date on when they had to dispose of their records. So when it was all said and done, I'll let you take a look at what we accomplished. That is, we were able to reduce the number of schedules from 140 schedules, some of which were massive. Like I say, these represented chapters in their manual, and I believe on the first slide I didn't emphasize it all that much, but there were 3,345 schedule items at last count that we were able to cut down. So we reduced the number of schedules down to 17, and we were able to close out one of the record groups because it was easy enough to see that we could roll their program records into the regular GSA record group. And not only that, the organization of GSA had changed somewhat so that particular line of business was really no longer a separate entity. So we succeeded in identifying new records, and we eliminated outdated records and descriptions, and we didn't necessarily supersede those because we didn't want it to give the appearance that somehow these records were still being created. We've actually created a side list of dispositions that are just invalid and no longer being used. So there's no confusion on the part of the program offices or, it wouldn't be for NARA's benefit because these would all be temporary records, but there would be no confusion on the part of the program offices that those records were no longer being created or managed under these new schedules. And we made a concerted effort to consolidate all of the like record types using RG69, which is the record group for the main GSA, to make it easy for people to go there and do it. And then as far as lessons learned, I think we did see all of the benefits and the shortcomings of big bucket scheduling in the course of doing this project. And one of the most difficult aspects in the course of doing a big bucket schedule was sort of having inclusive descriptions where you could, recognize all of the various types of records that would be included in a bucket. Now, we do have an extensive crosswalk to go along with each of the schedule items, but it's also good to be able to have a definitive item, especially if you're superseding a number of other items, to make sure that nothing gets lost in translation. And then one of the other difficulties that we had with it was, making sure that our, retention periods and bands that we wanted to apply to each of the buckets with regard to temporary records were actually going to work in the long term, because that was really what we were trying to do here, is write a schedule that hopefully would stand the test, or schedules that would stand the test of time, and that would be usable for everyone, both the agency and for NARA. So to give you an idea of how we approach this, in record group 269, we superseded 80 schedules with 14 new schedules. And I think you can see from the slide that we more or less picked, functional roles, within the organization to be able to consolidate items under, specific schedules. And then under each of these schedules, there would be the number of items necessary to capture all of the records being created under that function. So this is what the main GSA body of schedules looked like. And then for the Public Building Service, we were able to cut them down to 4 schedules from 20. And again, a very specific line of business with regard to GSA's, ownership and management and leasing of properties. And then we managed to get the Federal Acquisition Service down to a single schedule from 32 previous schedules, and again, dealing specifically with the acquisition services that the GSA performs. And then finally, with the information resources, we had one schedule that replaced 7 existing schedules to cover all of the IT and related records. So finally, now that we have these schedules in place, the agency is in the course of educating, all of the program offices in terms of schedule implementation and developing a new filing manual that is less chapter bound and more revolving around the structure of the schedules themselves. And then we have an ongoing concern about the maintenance of schedule crosswalks, because that's really the living document in terms of keeping, making sure the program offices of the agency can continue to use these schedules on an ongoing basis, that the crosswalks would be kept up to date, and also NARA could use those in the case of permanent records also. So we also are in the process of identifying all permanent records of all media types and planning for transfer to NARA. So one of the key areas here is because the agency is so involved with architectural drawings and building records. That's one, and of course their IT work. Those types of records are the kinds of things that we are working with them to capture, because we have, certainly architectural records that go back to the 1800s, and some of those records are still currently being used because the buildings themselves still exist, and they may be historic landmarks, but there are a lot of courthouses and post offices and different buildings around the country, federal properties that have a considerable age that are still being used. And then, of course, the more recent buildings are all being done, with computer-aided design and done electronically. So there's a wide swath of media and medium that we have to be concerned with. And then the agency, of course, is going to be responsible for monitoring and enforcing the flexible retention periods for all the various schedule items, and that's going to be a records management challenge, especially for an agency with 12,000 people and, you know, spread all over the country. So basically, the upside of this is that NARA and the agency, we are both very pleased with the outcome of this work, and that even though it took 5 years to do all of this, we feel like we have accomplished something in terms of bringing the agency's records management program sort of up to date. And considering, as I'm sure you all well know, the small numbers of people that are usually actively involved in records management at a corporate level, and the fact that I'm the appraisal archivist for not only GSA, but for other agencies such as the Department of Homeland Security and Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission and Coast Guard and some other big agencies, that basically this came down to being a two-person project, myself and the records officer at GSA, and then us, you know, working with our various counterparts and stakeholders within our organizations to get this done. So it was by no means a small project, but a very gratifying one. And I have to say that I'm not the only person at NARA that has done this sort of work. We have had several other appraisal archivists who are responsible for large agencies that, you know, in recent years and currently have been engaged in doing this sort of scheduling work to get agency schedules, you know, up to date and, you know, sort of media neutral and taking into account all of the, you know, record types that are currently being produced. So this is an ongoing project at NARA, this type of work, and we're engaged in it on a daily basis. So I want to thank you again for allowing me to join you today and present this project that we have done, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, this is Sarah Koonts. Can you all hear me?
I can, Sarah.
Yes.
Okay.
Hi,
All
Sarah.
right. If you would pass me the blue presenter's ball, I will get going.
And I'm going to put myself on mute here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Did you all see the slide change, or am I the only one? Okay, hold on. Becky, you have the controls. Can you turn it to our next slide?
No, I cannot.
Okay. Can someone pass me the controls?
I just changed it to your first slide, and Margaret can work on getting you the controls.
Okay. All right. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Again, my name is Sarah Koonts, and I'm at the State Archives of North Carolina, and Becky McGee-Lankford and I will be tag teaming on this short presentation about the development of our functional schedule in North Carolina. So I'm going to cover a little bit of the background on our setup here in North Carolina and a little bit about the development of the functional schedule, and then we'll cover some challenges and successes and a little bit about what we're calling appraisal required. So by way of background, I just wanted to set the stage because I know that in other states there's different setups for the Authority for Records Management. In North Carolina, we are the sole authority for records management, so all retention and disposition flows through our agency. And that started way back, as far back as 1935. An update to the Public Records Law gave our agency the sole authority to regulate destructions. And then in 1943, we started gathering our records officers from the state agencies together to talk about standards and best practices. And that sort of morphed into the 1950s when we built our first freestanding state agency record center, which was the first of its kind in its country. But that kind of prompted agencies to be a little bit more organized about working with us on record schedules, because now records are eligible to be transferred to us for retention. So this is really where we're going to see the beginning in the 1950s of these schedules based on agency hierarchy and on individual items and like file plans for individual agencies. This picture here is a gentleman named Admiral Patterson, who ran our records management program for a number of years, and he was responsible for a lot of those inventories. And indeed, our methodology was heavily dependent on these visits to agencies where we were going over what records they had. And the schedules themselves were very heavily dependent on format. So they would specify were records in paper, microfilm, both, and how long to keep those copies of those records. And then moving forward, as you move into the more modern era, we developed a general record schedule for state agency services that were common to all agencies in the early 2000s. That general schedule did not include archival records. So if something was archival or it's eligible to be transferred to the Record Center for permanent retention, that would still stay on the agency-specific schedule. This is a quick screenshot. I know it's a little bit difficult to read of an existing schedule that we had before we started the functional schedule. And you can see by the green arrow to the right of the screen that these schedules were very, very heavily dependent on knowing the agency hierarchy. So it's calling out the department, the office, the program, the unit, the branch, all of that. So the downside to that is anytime there was reorganization in state government or within an agency, suddenly all these schedules need to be updated because, again, everything's tied to that hierarchy in the agency. And then within that hierarchy, you see individual items with a unique item number and a name and a little bit about their format, a little description about them, and then individualized destruction instructions. So, again, this is very specific to an individual agency, and on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that you see the signatures from both our agency and the creating agency for the records were part of that process. So when we sat around and looked at what the situation was a few years ago, we realized some of the flaws that had developed in our existing system as state government really grew and expanded and records were coming in new format. And I like to kind of categorize this as the existing system had a lot of twos. So we were too tied to agency hierarchy. That made it too difficult to update the schedules in a quick manner. We had too small of buckets for these records, so they're very, very detailed. We found too much variance for similar records being kept in different agencies. And often it was too opaque of a system for users to understand, especially if they're new to state government. You have to know a little bit about the history of the agency and what individual office would be creating these records to quickly find some items on a schedule. And in modern times, we were seeing that agencies were really sharing data across agencies. So we're not seeing data just sitting in one filing cabinet in one office in one agency. So we needed to be more responsive to the way that agencies were keeping records in the modern times. So we did have a challenge, and we can't just throw out the whole baby and the bathwater here. Our existing system had all this historical data about all the records that had come through the Record Center from the beginning of time. And so we don't want to lose all that detail about the retention of archival records in North Carolina. So we kind of needed to keep some things, but we wanted to make some things better. We were also seeing, too, that there was an increased need for our analysts to spend more time on appraising records with agencies, really digging into some meaty questions, as opposed to just working on file plans and, individual lists of records that might be similar across different agencies. So that's where we found ourselves when we were moving towards looking at something new. And as we were developing this functional schedule, we looked across at other templates that were out there for kind of general schedules and overall schedules, explored a lot of them, including one idea was to have a general schedule for every agency. And we ended up discarding all of those in favor of the structure that we settled on that we call the functional schedule, and it's based around the core functions of state government and then the records that support those functions. So a little bit about the process, you can see it on the bulleted list here. But basically, we reviewed statutes and talked to agencies and looked at their administrative code to find out really what were the core functions for state government. And after we drafted that list of core functions, then we're going to run it by the agency for their input. And we started putting items from existing schedules into these buckets with the new functions. And throughout the process, we're having focus groups, stakeholder meetings, a lot of internal review where we're just exploring, you know, the work that had been done function by function to see what works, what doesn't work, do we need to move anything? You know, as revisions came up, those were also reviewed by stakeholder groups. As a function was drafted and the records related to that function were drafted, they were posted to a blog for anyone to make comments on. And finally, that last bullet was a CRO review. That's our shorthand for Chief Records Officers. So we allowed them time to gather periodically and look at what we had drafted and comment on what they thought our progress was looking like. I'm going to flip through these pretty quickly. They're not meant to be read in great detail, but this gives you an idea of the structure of the functional schedule by those core functions. So you can see that each of them has a number, they're in order, and then the subfunctions, the numerical code is tied to that overall function number. So for example, agency management is number 1, 1.1 is organizational structure, 1.2 information management operations. So those are the subfunctions that hang off the core function. And I'll just flip through these here and you can get a sense of the core functions that were identified, you know, financial management, governance, healthcare. And I should say here that not all agencies are going to be, you know, using all of these records. Some will use all of these functions, or one function. So for example, human resources, everybody has human resources records. But if an agency does not do something like healthcare or law enforcement, they are not needing to sign off on that particular aspect of the functional schedule. And we are setting it up that we will review this yearly. That's part of the process, and they will sign off on any new changes and updates to every function. So that's the core functions, and I'm going to turn it over to Becky. And Becky, just let me know, and I'll just flip the slides for you.
Okay, sounds good. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So let's look at the standards close up, at least one of them. And so what you see here is the legal standard. And you can see that there's a definition for it. You can also see the subfunctions, as well as information on the triggers. What I mean by is disposition triggers for the files found in the standard. It also includes an overall confidentiality information for the records within that standard as well. Next slide. This slide is a close-up of how a function is presented. So what you see here is we start off with a brief overview of the function. The RC column, which is displayed on the left side, is the numbering system that we developed to easily identify the placement of a type of record. In this case, the 15 represents the standard, which is standard 15, public relations. The 4 is the fourth subfunction, which is marketing and publicity. And the 1 is it means it's the first item in that subfunction. The remainder of that string reflects the retention. So after the point, you may see an A, which is transfer to the state archives. You may see a P, which means retain an office permanently or contact us for appraisal. The R means destroy an office when reference value ends. And what we do there is we want an agency to have an internal policy about defining what reference value means to them. So they will set a retention in-house for that. S means destroy when superseded or obsolete. The less than means retain shorter than a year. And if there's a number there, that is the number of years of the retention. Next slide. In addition, there are certain types of records that are very specific to one agency, and so we needed to call those out and demonstrate who the sole owner of that record is. These are marked with a black bar, and the agency is in the description's name or in the description. This item is a big bucket for coursework, but specifically calls out that department, which is Department of Justice, that has permanently archival valuable records that come to us. Next slide. So in order to document what records transfer to us, we have a transfer list at the end of each of the functions, And this is an example of one of those transfer lists. It notes all the records that are eligible for transfer and their former item number. We will retain that number for anything that crosses our records center doors. And the main reason for that is people are very familiar with what their old item number was if they were transferring records to us. So we wanted to make sure that there was something easily identifiable in the new schedule that would allow them to transfer, as well as what Sarah was talking about, all that historically valuable information that we already have in with our system is tied to that old number. Also, please note that there is a lot of part of this process we are doing is a lot of reappraisal of materials in the State Record Center as well. We also notified agencies that if they hadn't transferred anything from a particular item to us in a long time, they needed to notify us if that was still an active series. Otherwise, we assumed it could be deleted or removed from the transfer list. So if they do decide they need to transfer those materials, they will have to go through the appraisal process to determine whether those records can be transferred because they've been taken off the transfer list. Next slide. So for this group, next two slides, we're going to look at how the bigger bucket approach worked very well for specific record groups. This particular one, and it really worked well with the boards and commissions, and this is the Board of Nursing. This whole page and group of items is devoted to licensing files of some form or another. Lots of granularity here, and probably these do not represent discrete files, but concepts. And they're sorted by name and not necessarily by function. Next slide. So staff spent a lot of time dealing with professional licensures. It turns out that a good chunk of the old retentions were based on agency preference and not statutes. Only a small portion of the professional licenses are lifetime, and many require renewal. The renewal process was often written in paper and in the mind for the old schedule. The new bigger buckets include all licensing, incorporated the two triggers for retention, which is the expiration or the renewal of the license. The new bigger buckets also allow boards to manage their own inactive periods with expiration, meaning when the license couldn't be renewed from the original application. New schedule standardized minimum retention, and the boards were welcome to keep them longer if needed for their own internal use. So here are some of our successes. We have uniformity across agencies, actual examinations of a minimum retention periods that are based on statute, not on agency's preference, flexibility to incorporate a specific group of records, such as the governor's office. We incorporated that into the governance standard because we recognize that most of the items in the governor's office are unique and needed to be easily identified. We working more with agencies as a group, able to discern how changes impact agencies across government. More agencies now under a standard like the boards and commissions create a whole new set of training ads and assistance to agencies. We created a process for regular review and update, which we will be doing yearly. Some of the challenges have included agency pushback for preferences on retention. That's always going to be the case. Working out complex big buckets like monitoring versus compliance and licensing. We had a lot of discussion about that and had to do some tweaking based off of those discussions. Complex differentiation among boards with adjudicating authority, and that pushback between what is a board that has one set of authority versus another, we ended up breaking around the rulemaking authority over adjudication of claims and quasi-judicial authority, and such as, in the governance standard, the legal standard, and monitoring compliance is where we put those items. One agency even complained about what standard they are not included in, which we found interesting. Next slide. The large driver in this process was a desire to have the analysts spend less time doing those inventories and tedious updates and more time on the appraisal with agencies. This shows up with unscheduled records, of course. Also, many series required appraisal as a transfer trigger now. So, we need to go in and actually appraise the records prior to transfer. And we are doing some reappraisal of our existing holdings as well to determine whether those records still meet our appraisal criteria for archival records. Next slide. An example of appraisal at transfer is our Department of Justice and the court records. These were previously brought in large groups of litigation by unit or group. May have important and mundane litigation commingled. Examples include like personnel files or smaller legal actions involving agencies along with those landmark cases. The goal now is prior to transfer to work with the agency to determine the cases that are have true archival value, such as things of historical significance to an agency like our Bill of Rights case, those things that may have been heard before the Supreme Court, those cases that changed the law, landmark cases like the Willie M. case, and those large composite litigations, all of which are archival and should be retained. This type of concept is in many of the standards. So when you look through our schedules, you'll see that a lot of them say appraisal required. We want to have the agency help us determine the bigger stuff over the mundane and pull out those critical items for transfer without having to take hundreds of cubic feet that we don't necessarily need. Next slide. Another example of appraisal was with our Department of Transportation records with unscheduled records. The idea is the archivist and appraisal archivist talk to an agency about the series. They're going to physically look at it if necessary. They understand how used and how it relates to the functional schedule, how the record series is used and how it relates to the functional schedule. They're going to review agency needs. They're also going to review federal and state statutes and determine historical significance. And they're going to then make recommendations based on that review for our own internal review and determination. An example of this is exchange drawings in the Department of DOT. They were in the agency superseded by electronic records. Many of the exchanges, and what I mean by the exchanges is highway exchanges, are no longer referenced by the agency. The landowner's data can be found somewhere else, and it ended up being only a historical look at how a process was done in the past instead of what would be a historical record. So it was determined that we would not continue to collect those records. Next slide. So I think we've met our goals to begin redirecting work of our analysts and archivists more towards appraisal and records management guidance to the agencies and less about collecting those inventories and detailed item-by-item retention schedules. The foundation of the functional schedule is strong, but it's also flexible. It's going to allow us to adapt to changing record-keeping practices and additions to what records the different agencies retain. And we're hoping that it results in a more efficient way of assisting agencies, less bureaucracy for dealing with unscheduled records requests or schedule changes, as well as us being the front guard to getting out there and dealing with records appraisal and really focusing on retaining those records of archivable value and getting them into the state archives. So that's all I have. And there are our contact information if you have any questions, and I'm going to turn it back over to the moderator.
More about teams and resources that were engaged in the GSA initiative?
I didn't get the full question. Can you repeat it, please?
Sure. Can you describe a bit more about the teams and resources that were engaged in the GSA initiative?
Well, initially, it began as a NARA reimbursable project, which would have involved probably 2 or 3 people. And then from there, the GSA, again, that part didn't work out. So basically, the team was basically myself. I worked on it, but there were a few of these schedules that I did have other appraisal archivists in my division assist with. So at any given time, we probably had 3 or 4 people working individually on independent schedules. But the framework was already laid and set out by myself and the records officer at the agency. And then once the schedules were developed and certified and sent to NARA for review and approval, that was when we involved, as many as 3 or 4 other appraisers to handle those individual schedules individually and work them through our approval process.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Becky, were there any more questions that came through chat that I can't see? If not, does anyone have any other questions?
This is Meg. I do see one question at the very end that came in for North Carolina, asking how many staff North Carolina has to work on the various aspects of their project.
So this is Sarah. I'll answer that. We have 7 records analysts for all state, local, and municipal county government, state analysts. So the analysts all worked on it. Becky and I worked on it. We drafted in other people with expertise in certain areas, so some of our digital services people would comment on drafts and things. But basically, this was a project out of the records analysis unit with 7 people.
Thank you.
Still doing the other work, too, at the same time.
As always, of course.
Thank you. There's any other questions? Otherwise, Meg or Barbara, I think it's back to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all so much. That really was very interesting. And for all our friends, who we know people who aren't records managers and archivists, and they don't think what we do is interesting. That really was very interesting to talk about, going from sort of old style scheduling to moving to more functional big bucket scheduling. So we really appreciate you being with us today, Lloyd and Sarah and Becky. So thank you so much. We just have a couple of things. We know we're going to run over. We don't want to do that. So we have here you can contact CoSA in many different ways. You're able to use our website, our resource center, and contact us on Twitter or Facebook. We do have the case studies that both North Carolina and the National Archives submitted for the summer meeting where we discuss these as well. They're available on the reports and surveys part of our website if you want to take a look at those, or if you can't find those, please let me know and we'll get a copy for you or send you the link. And then, Meg, we have NARA's contact info here if you want to mention anything. I know we don't have all your Twitter handles here.
We have a lot. That NARA social media directory at the bottom serves as a hub point for all of our social media accounts. But I think most of you know how to find our general website. And of course, if you have any questions about our specific practices, you are always welcome to write to me, and I'll make sure it gets to the right person on staff at NARA. So I'm meg.phillips with 2 L's at nara.gov, and you are more than welcome to use me as a contact point at the National Archives. And while I have the mic, I think we're going to be very eager to hear if there are other webinar topics that people would be interested in hearing a little drill down from both the federal and state level. So please let Barbara know or let me know what you'd be interested in hearing about in the future.
And thank you, Meg. That's also a very good plug for the webinar evaluation. We actually have a place in the evaluation where you can tell us other things that you're interested in because we're going to start looking at our quarterly webinars for 2019 that NARA and CoSA will do together. So if you have any feedback, please let us know in the webinar evaluation or contact Meg or me. Or both, if you really want your topic to rise to the top. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And we appreciate our guests from the National Archives and also from the North Carolina State Archives and Jamie for helping us. And when you're filling out the webinar, please be kind with our technical difficulties. We're learning as we go, so we appreciate you learning with us. Thank you so much, and we will see you at another webinar in 2019.
And to
Bye,
North Carolina, best wishes with your snow.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.